You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I interviewed Katlin Robinson. Katlin is a yoga therapist based in Ontario, Canada. She specializes in yoga and mindfulness for mental health and women's wellness. Katlin is also a graduate of our program, Inner Peace Yoga Therapy. And today we're going to explore the current work that she's doing at the intersections of yoga and mental health, specifically with the technique known as emotion-focused therapy for complex trauma. Katlin's become increasingly interested in how yoga practices help facilitate emotional processing and resilience as part of trauma healing. And we'll discuss this and more on the podcast today. It's always great to spend some time with you, Katlin. It's great to have you here and to have you share this with our listeners.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
I'd love if you could just give our listeners a brief introduction to your background. How long have you been teaching yoga and practicing yoga therapy, and really what brought you on this path in the first place?
Well, I started practicing yoga in the 1980s, so that's a long time, and took a hiatus during my 20s to do what 20-year-olds do. Came back to it in a dedicated way in my 30s, so about 20 years ago. Had always had the dream of doing yoga teacher training and manifested that dream, so to speak, in 2013. And I knew pretty much right away that I wanted to do something more therapeutic, and yoga therapy came to me. I hadn't actually even really heard of it as a thing before I started doing my research on how to deepen these practices so that they're more therapeutic, if you can say that. I mean, I think the practices are therapeutic, but figure out how to offer them in a more therapeutic way as opposed to a group setting. So I started with Inner Peace in 2014, and it took me 3 years, I think, to complete my certification. And also knew very quickly that mental health was the area that I wanted to specialize in. That kind of, it's specific in some ways and very broad in other ways. So when I did my extra modalities, I worked with Antonio Sosis and did the yoga for mood management with Amy Weintraub, and did a couple of different trainings around yoga for trauma. And have always had an interest in women's wellness, but I would say, like, universally, what I find is that when I say women's wellness, it's almost always about mental health as well. And so I've been doing that really since I started my level 1. And when I did all my practicums, they were really centered around mental health.
So you've been at it for a good 10 years now, really, this yoga therapy thing. And I know that we're going to talk about where it's taken you now, and I'm going to kind of introduce perhaps our listeners to this concept known as emotion-focused therapy for complex trauma, EFTT, which is different from EFT. Now, this is not your technique, but maybe you can share with our listeners who may not be familiar with it what emotion-focused therapy is, and then we'll get into more about how you're integrating yoga therapy with it a little bit later.
Yeah, so not to be confused with the tapping, which unfortunate that they have the same acronym and it does get confused, but EFT, emotion-focused therapy, is psychotherapy, so a specialization for therapists, just like, I mean, probably the most well-recognized is CBT, but there are a lot of other modalities that psychotherapists specialize in, and this is one. It's well researched and evolved out of a humanistic theory. And so Dr. Pabio, it's quite well established, although not as well recognized as something like CBT, but Dr. Pabio, who's also my mom, for full disclosure, helped to develop or evolve emotion focused therapy so that it specifically addressed complex trauma. So she started that work in the 1990s and is quite well recognized in the trauma field for the work that she's done, and also as one of the original, I don't know if she would call herself a founder, but I'll say, for lack of a better word, founders, or person who helped to evolve EFT. And so the foundation of this trauma modality, and I think I need to be really clear that I'm not a specialist in emotion focused therapy. I worked with Dr. Pavio to integrate yoga therapy, but it's really, she is the specialist in it.
Yeah.
And so what's really interesting to me about emotion focused therapy is that rather than behavioral change, they're really, and in particular, Dr. Pavio is really interested in how we use emotions as a foundation for meaning making, and that meaning making is central to how we heal trauma. And that's really different in a lot of ways from the discourse around trauma therapy, which tends to be, I mean, CBT is a classic one where it's around behavioral change. There's also a common discourse that you don't need to go into the story of trauma in order to be able to heal it. So there's, there is a lot of conversation around how it's, especially I think in yoga therapy, around regulation. And we were talking about this in the training that I just finished with you, and this idea that we are complex beings and we are social beings. And so when we've experienced something that's created a trauma imprint that's connected with another human being, as it is in complex trauma, and there's been some kind of a massive breach in a relationship, then it's inevitable that that creates a ripple effect in our emotional processing and in the way that we express emotions. And so after we do the regulation piece, which is essential, people can't, I think my experience, I think experts would agree, you can't address the deeper struggles that trauma creates until you're regulated. So we do that first. Yoga is really good at helping people to regulate. But then I would imagine many yoga therapists who work in mental health realize very quickly that after people are regulated, I mean, they feel a lot better than they did before, but there's still so much more to unpack. And so EFT and the work of Dr. Pavio kind of takes people after they've found that piece of regulation. I don't know if she would necessarily say that there's a cutoff point where it's like you go from regulation into EFT, but definitely it's better suited for people who have some degree of regulation, and then start talking about the story and start talking about what the meaning is behind the story, and talking about maladaptive versus adaptive emotions and how to transform rage into productive anger. And that's one that's super interesting to me, how to transform depression into sadness and anxiety into recognizing fear, and how fear is a central part of what happens when we've experienced trauma, and that it's not, fear isn't always maladaptive. And so, what we had talked about in our training was how there's so much conversation around in the yoga world around regulating and being balanced, and this idea of constantly being in homeostasis, right? Like the foundation of yoga is stilling the mind, but as a human being, we are complex.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the yoga therapy piece then. So if there's this foundational technique, the emotion focused therapy, and your mom's had a big hand in this body of work, right, around complex trauma. And you're looking at how yoga therapy can be a nice complement to this. It sounds like it's more than just regulating, right? It sounds like it's more than bringing ourselves to balance, but maybe that's the piece. So I'd love for you to just kind of share with us how you are integrating yoga therapy into this work, and how is it a good fit, and what are you specifically doing? I know you've had a hand in this, including a book and a training. Can you share more about sort of the scope of the yoga therapy piece that matches here?
Yeah. So to clarify, it's a chapter in a book that already exists. So in the
Great.
second edition of the book, there was a chapter added on integrating yoga therapy. So
Perfect.
I think talking about what I'm doing in my own work is, and talking about how it's being integrated, are kind of the same conversations. So one of the things that we hear a lot in yoga is this idea of yogashchitriti nirodha, right? This idea of stilling the mind, and this idea of finding balance. And what I love about the work that I'm doing with Dr. Pavio, and also really curious about it, my own work, is how do we use these practices to actually allow people to more fully express emotions outside of regulation and calmness. Right? So I use anger as such a perfect example, but also upregulation, empowerment. And so, if we take poses like the Warrior series or mudras, one of my favorite mudras is Matangi Mudra, right? Which is so empowering and really resonant with a lot of people who've experienced trauma because of the posture of the hands as we take it, and the meaning of the middle finger. And so if you don't know what Matangi Mudra is, it's basically interlacing your fingers, and then the middle fingers extend and touch. So allowing people to experience in their body these postures and gestures of empowerment, so that when they're feeling disempowered, which is inherent in trauma, they can have an embodied experience of what power feels like. And so with EFTT, one of the things that we wanted to do was figure out how we could integrate yoga practices directly into the therapeutic process. So in a lot of therapies, yoga is kind of a homework assignment, so to speak, or secondary, or it's done as a calming technique or a compassion technique outside of the actual dialogue and processing that happens. So if an EFTT therapist is working with somebody who's in a state of collapse and feeling and remembering a state of disempowerment, and not able to come out of that in order to be able to progress through the therapeutic process, then what kind of practices or postures could a therapist integrate so that somebody could have a conversation about a trauma that happened while they're in an embodied experience of empowerment, rather than trying to talk about an experience where they were disempowered with an embodied experience of disempowerment. And you can see how that would be the way the conversation could happen, and the transformation can be quite profound. So if somebody's talking about somebody who has sexually assaulted them while they're in collapse, and trying to make meaning of that, the way that they're going to be talking about that, it tends to enhance the maladaptive part of that experience, right? The collapse and sadness becomes more shame and all of the things that we're trying to transform. So if you can come out of that embodied state and hold Matangi Mudra, or one of the simplest things that I teach and that we find is effective is just standing up.
Yeah.
Simple act of standing and talking about an experience that you've had where you've been disempowered, where you've lost your power, all of a sudden gives you this sense of power. And so that is in itself transformative, and so helps clients to not only feel the transformation that they're trying to develop through the therapy, but also process the experience that they've had in a more helpful and adaptive way.
Very cool. So it sounds like you are training these psychotherapists then that are already using this modality in their practice to integrate the yoga aspects. Is that right?
Exactly. Dr. Pavio does have a yoga teacher training, but we didn't want the therapist to need a YTT in order to be able to integrate these, right? So it was about creating a therapy and developing this chapter so that psychologists could use yoga-based practices without needing to do a 200-hour training, which is wonderful and I think important in some ways, but is also a barrier. You know, people, if for psychotherapists to need a 200-hour training in order to be able to integrate a mudra and understand how standing is so much more empowering than sitting in collapse, means that, you know, these ideas can't be spread as broadly. So that was really important in the training that we did. So the training and the chapter were both developed based on this idea that we wanted simple practices and ideas that therapists could learn and understand and start to integrate very quickly. So they don't have the full philosophical background. We're not teaching about structured postures or the more subtle aspects of the practices, but honestly, like, isn't that exactly what we do with our clients anyways, right? So I'm not teaching, if I'm telling my clients about Matangi Mudra, unless they're interested, I'm not going into the subtle body details of why this is effective. What I want more than anything is for them to be able to feel and experience some sense of power holding that gesture. If it doesn't work for them, then we try something different. So anyways, back to the training that we're doing with the therapists, it's a similar idea, giving them a really foundational, very brief explanation of why warrior would be empowering. But I think for most people, it's very intuitive, right? We understand why a warrior pose feels more empowering than sitting in collapse. The other practice that I got really excited about, which we do go into a little bit more detail in the training and aligns really well with some of the other work that EFT therapists are doing, is Sankalpa. The idea with Sankalpa in my work, and then as well in the work that Dr. Pavio and I are developing, is it's really hard to find transformation when you're feeling chronically disempowered. It's for many people hard to even imagine what better feels like. And so going through a process of finding a sankalpa, finding a goal or an intention with people, helps to give them, in this context, a vision for what healing might look like. And that's really important, I think, both in talk therapy and in yoga therapy. So how do you want to show up in the world, right? How do you want to be? And with talk therapy, there is opportunity to spend a lot of time thinking about that and talking about what goals are. I mean, most therapies talk about goal. It's kind of a central part, but we layer onto that in the work that I do. It's way beyond the kind of positive affirmation. And I'm really trying to create for people either a vision or a posture. And so bringing Sankalpa to an embodied level outside of just words. And so for some people, words are where they have to start. If they don't know what better feels like, then, but you can work with somebody to say, what would being more peaceful or more calm, how do you imagine that would feel? And most people will say, I think that would be really good. So you start there and then you evolve it into, I'm flipping back and forth between the EFT, but in the work that I'm doing, it's going through postures and going through images to try to give them an experience or a guided meditation. I mean, Yoga Nidra is really fantastic for this because things can emerge from a Yoga Nidra session that they maybe couldn't put their finger on before. But giving them an embodied experience of their Sankalpa reinforces it way beyond what just words are. And so in the EFTT, doing something similar where maybe it's a posture, maybe it's a vision. And then the wonderful thing about Sankalpa, both in EFTT and in the work that I'm doing, is we can use it as a guidepost so that over the course of the work that we do, we can see how the Sankalpa might evolve, but also see how easier it is to access. After 10 sessions, if somebody isn't, well, even less than 10 sessions, if in a short period of time, if people aren't able to experience this embodied sense of their Sankalpa for a more extended period of time in a superficial way, then something needs to shift because it's not whatever the therapy isn't being effective if we know that that's their goal.
Right. Wow. Well, I could see how this would be such a useful skill set for therapists to start to incorporate. And of course, my hope is that they would be inspired to learn more about yoga, right? And do that 200-hour YTT and get a better sense. But I also understand the practicality of providing really readily accessible tools into the hands of therapists where they are, in the moment that they're in. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing here and the foresight that you and your mom had together to weave together the modalities in this way. It sounds like you're training folks in Europe. Tell us who the audience has been so far, or what do you have upcoming in terms of trainings where you're bringing yoga therapy to these therapists?
Well, there's nothing coming up immediately, but all of what we've done is in Europe. And I've done a few, a bit of an introduction to a group in Los Angeles and a group in Toronto, which is where my mom is based. So the trainings that we've done are mostly in EFT clinics. The clinics are specifically focused on EFT, and they tend to do advanced training with therapists, so that the clinics are a training facility as well as a resource for clients. And so that's, the connection that we have in Europe tends to be what the connections that Dr. Pavio has. So she's been running trainings just for the basic EFTT in those clinics for many years. And so then
I see.
The invitation to them was to do this second level while the chapter was in development, and then after it was published as well.
That's really great. Well, I'd love to kind of see if there's anything else you'd like to share on this subject, and then maybe kind of wrap up with you just kind of telling us more about yourself. So is there anything else about EFTT and yoga therapy that excites you right now that you want to share with our listeners?
One of the things that I do want to say is that it was definitely in my mind as I was developing this, being sensitive to not wanting to offer these without the context of yoga, because you'd said that before, the whole context of a yoga teacher training. And so that was always in the back of my mind. And I think trying to be very sensitive to the fact that I'm not teaching psychologists how to be yoga teachers, and also really wanting to impress on them that there are many, many practices that should be done in collaboration with yoga therapists. And interestingly, there were quite a few psychologists who came to the training who already had their YTTs, and even a couple of yoga therapists. So this was kind of enhancing what they were already doing. So I think it is important to bridge and promote an integrated approach to trauma healing. Aside from a yoga therapy perspective, I think it is really important that we start building a repertoire of practices around this idea of emotional experience outside of just regulation. And that certainly goes outside of what the history of yoga has been and how it's been taught, and even what I've been taught in my yoga for trauma trainings that I've taken and the books, especially in particular for complex trauma, where after the regulation, it almost feels like we skip over the emotions. We go through Annamaya and Pranamaya Kosha, and then we skip over Manomaya Kosha and we go into Vijnanamaya and then Anandamaya. And it's almost like this idea of emotional bypassing in some ways. And it perpetuates a cultural fear of emotions and that emotions are not safe. I hear a lot this idea that once people get regulated, once a yoga therapist helps their client, or even a yoga teacher helps their client get regulated, then it gets handed off to the therapists. And we miss this incredible source of wisdom, teachings, and practices that help people experience the full breadth of human emotion through these practices. And there is a sensitivity that I've observed in trainings around not wanting to go outside of our scope of practice. And so where emotions kind of becomes outside of yoga's scope of practice, which in my mind is saying that Manomaya Kosha is outside of our scope of practice.
I see.
So I say that very cautiously because we aren't therapists, right? What we're doing is we're using yoga philosophy and yoga and embodied practices to help people experience healthy emotions without needing to go into a dialogue about it. Yeah. So that's where I'm super interested, and understanding where does the scope of practice begin and end. And sometimes I have felt unclear about that. I mean, I understand really clearly in my practice that I'm not a psychologist and that it's not talk therapy, but at the same time, trying to use these practices to help support emotional regulation. And so I found most of my clients find it very helpful to be working with a psychologist and the yoga therapist at the same time, right? So that absolutely, and that there's an understanding of what's happening in the therapy, and the therapist understands what's happening in the yoga therapy. And so navigating that is sometimes confusing and sometimes not super, in some ways, not super clear. So I think it would be really great to be having more conversation in the yoga therapy space around this idea of Manomaya Kosha and where our scope of practice begins and ends.
I think we could probably talk for another half an hour on that. But in interest of time today, let's save it for perhaps another podcast. I'd love to wrap up and have you share just a little bit more about ourselves, like taking it back to the personal. Like, what does Katlin do to kind of help her operate as a human being and as a yoga therapist, and in all the ways that you work in the world and interact with the world? Like, tell us about your yoga practices that you do on a regular basis.
Well, I would say that as my yoga practice evolves, it becomes much more like an abstract artist, where you have to kind of use a foundation and then you kind of go off and explore. And so I'm really, in my practice, very dedicated to being non-prescriptive about it. So in the asana, it's like, what do I feel like today? Exploring. I think the three things that are really central are I'm a sankalpa and a sound sandwich. So starting with sankalpa, finishing with sound. So mantra and chanting, in my mind, are just absolutely critical for regulation and for healing and for this idea of self-expression, finding an opportunity for self-expression. And then what happens in between is a lot of breathing and breath connected with movement. And so personally, I like to continue movement. It's almost like a dance-like movement. And then reverence. And I would say for me, reverence is really around connectivity and reverence to the universe and to humanity, and connectivity and reverence to Mother Earth is. Mm-hmm. And so the asana part is that part that's very variable, and but those other things stay very consistent in my practice.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today, Katlin. It's got me thinking about a lot of things, what you shared, and it's also really exciting for me always to see how yoga is being picked up in other places, and yet, here we are as yoga therapists with sort of the deepest level of training and background and certification to take the full breadth, right, of what yoga has to offer in a therapeutic context. And I think it always has been important to look at the holistic approach and work on a collaborative team with other healthcare providers too. So thanks so much for taking the time to share with our listeners today.
My pleasure. I hope there were some nuggets in there that were helpful for everyone.
Indeed. If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.